to be here, give you a little bit of a sense of who I am before we get into who you are. So I have really spent the first decade of my career in my 20s, 27 right now. In my 20s, I focused on direct service and advocacy, and so I ran youth programs and did that work in a community center, you know, the life's work that many of you have committed yourselves to, and, you know, had children that were in my program that could only come if because they were homeless, they would need to stay at my place some nights, and, you know, that deep work where you are just going to hold on to all of those kids and help them get to the services they need. I, of course, would have that experience where we'd take kids back into the neighborhood after the programs, and other kids would run up and say, "Oh, Miss Elizabeth, can I get in Safe Haven?" And I would have to say, "I'm sorry, we don't have any more slots." And to me, it's almost criminal that a young child is coming and asking if they can get positive supports, positive opportunities, and you have to turn them away. So this last decade of my career has really been devoted to working with state and local policymakers to align the things that they're doing in better service to young people. So across a whole host of departments and divisions and nonprofits and philanthropy to really think about how do we bring all of our forces to bear to ensure that every kid can get into one of these positive opportunities. We looked under cushions, you know, we've really tried to find the resources to support that full set of all kids having access. And I think that, you know, we've done a pretty good job in a lot of places of patching things together. This next decade of my career, though, and I'm going to end with this at the end of our hour together, is really focused on resources and how do we garner the necessary resources to really support our young people in all the ways we know are going to get them to better outcomes. So I'll touch on that a little bit at the end. But that's sort of who I am and what the trajectory of my career has been. So we're going to do a brief logistics, and yes, it does say take out your cell phones. That is not because I want you to go on Facebook or do any Googling of things, but it's because we're going to, throughout the course of this, do a little bit of polling. I want to be able to poll you to find out where you stand on some things. So if you could take out your cell phone, and then as if you're typing in a new number, you're going to text someone. You're going to text to the number 22333. So type in that phone number, 22333. And then in the message, you're going to write, "Ready by 21." And then hit send. And you should receive a confirmation text. Maybe raise your hand once you receive a confirmation text. Okay, help your neighbor if they're struggling. I hear the texts coming in. Okay, are we good on that? Everybody got it? Neighbors, help your neighbors if. So we're going to use that throughout the rest of the hour. So who are we at the Forum for Youth Investment? We have been around for about 15, 16 years, something like that, and we're based in DC. We're a national organization, a nonprofit, a nonpartisan organization. We call ourselves an action tank. You know, there's plenty of think tanks in DC, but we are what we consider an action tank because we really try to get out into states and communities and understand what's working, what's not working, and then share that with others. So we have this luxury of being able to see a lot of the best practices happening for children and youth, and then share them with folks around the country. And, you know, we do that with a whole bunch of different types of partners, from government to schools to business to youth themselves, whole host of folks. And we've got a lot of, if you haven't been to our website, we have a lot of tools and resources there for people that are really trying to ensure that all young people are ready for, we talk about college, ready for work, ready for life. People sometimes will challenge us on the college thing, and I say, you know what, our job is to ensure that they are ready should they choose to go to college. So we can talk about that offline later if anybody wants to challenge me on that one. So we really try to get out there and help people to put the right set of supports and opportunities in place to get young people ready. So what are we going to talk about today? So I want to get a sense with the voting of who's in the room here. Going to spend some time talking about outcomes and how to get to those big population level outcomes. Then I want to talk a little bit more, drill down about the family, school, and community supports that need to be in place to get to those outcomes. And then, very importantly, because I know collective impact is a part of the theme of this year's conference, I want to talk about the leadership and how to harness that and how to get people sort of working in the same direction together. And then talk a little bit more and have some discussion at your tables about, what role you can play in that whole collective impact ecosystem. So there's some handouts on your table, and we're going to turn to those towards the end. But I'm going to encourage you to think really deeply about your organization and where it falls in this ecosystem in the state of Ohio. And then maybe a little bit of time for some policy levers that I think you could pull, and some resources for your work, and we'll close with that. So just to hop into who you are, we use this stakeholder wheel, we call it, a lot of times when we do community meetings where we're trying to get a sense of, do we have the right people in the room to really wrap around young people and do all the things we know are necessary for them to be successful? So we've used this to kind of help people think broadly about who are those people. So in terms of the roles that people play, in terms of the settings where young people live, and in terms of the services and systems that need to be at the table. So we're going to do our first vote here. So what role are you in? So the question is, are you sitting mostly in a public policy space, research, advocacy, practice, meaning direct practice, direct service, philanthropy, some combination of those, or something else that I haven't listed there? What would you most classify your work as? As suspected, I thought we'd have a pretty big group of practitioners here in the room, which is great. And some of you are crossing boundaries. You're doing multiple of these things. Where's the research here at Ohio University? You're small but mighty. You're in combo. Okay, there you go. Great. So that gives us a sense. Oh, they're still coming in, still coming in. And we will share this data with the team so you all can have access to who is here and what roles people play. So one more question. Oh, one more question. We're moving on to a new question. What system do you work in? Are you in the early childhood system, mental health, the school system, juvenile justice, child welfare, or foster care, a combination of those, or something else? Maybe you call it something besides child welfare. Or maybe those people just aren't here. Yeah. So the combo and the other, you're thinking substance abuse would be sort of separate from mental health, probably. Other. Yeah, maybe yell out a couple of others just so we get you counted. Anybody else? What'd you say? Senior services. Nice. Domestic violence. Any others? Okay. Great. So that's really helpful to know who's here. And that you all seem to be, in most cases, doing a lot of crossover work. So you're not just working with one population. You're not just touching into one sector. That's great. So if you have an office inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., you must have a theory of change. And so this is our theory of change, that if we're really going to get to all young people ready by 21, ready for college, ready for work, ready for life, if we're going to have them be developmentally on track, be productive and connected and healthy and safe, that we're going to have to put a few things in place in a pretty organized fashion. And so we used to go and talk to people, and I was just telling this to Jessica, we used to go and talk to people about positive youth development. Our founder, Karen Pittman, has been one of the leading thinkers, and problem-free isn't fully prepared. We need to focus on positive youth development. We'd go into a room like this, people would leave energized and excited about this concept of positive youth development, but they wouldn't have the understanding of what they were supposed to do to make that happen. And so Ready by 21 was really our way of starting to help people almost have some closet organizers to their work, to be able to say, here's the end game we're going for young people. Here's the set of supports we need to put in place. And here's what we need to do as leaders to act differently to get that set of supports in place. So the theory of change is really that if we start doing some things differently in terms of our leadership and the accountability that we have to, being in partnership with one another, to setting big enough goals that are really going to get us to that end game, to tracking data and sharing data and using data in more efficient ways, and then to developing some bold strategies. If we can do that as a group of leaders, we're going to be able to really turn this gear in the middle, which is about the family, school, and community supports that we know. I have a 17-year-old, and I know all of those different supports that it takes to get him to the place where he is, and hopefully into a place like this in a year or so. So, are those supports coordinated? Are they accessible? Are they high quality? Are they well attended? If they're not attended, it doesn't really help. So how you get leaders to put that set of supports in place so that you can actually turn that big gear. And the big gear is obviously the end game. We want all children and youth productive, connected, healthy, safe. And it's going to take really paying close attention to each of these gears to get us there. So the challenge, of course, is that to get real population level change in that big gear can take a good 5 to 10 years to see, a full shift in across the state of Ohio, the outcomes that young people are achieving. It can take it can take 3 to 5 years to get that right set of supports and opportunities in place. Really making those programs and services work better together can take some time. Getting the funding streams working in the right direction, right? So really, the thing that I encourage people to start thinking about now is how we, in a year or two's time, come together as leaders and do some things differently, and make sure that we're tracking along the way all of these other pieces, so that 5 to 10 years from now, we can look back and say, we did these things in this small gear. It made these supports look better in this middle gear, and ultimately, it's had an effect on this big gear. Now, the challenge, of course, is that we all move around. Deck chairs are reorganized. So we've got to be able to sort of be in a collective space together and trust each other, and have a plan for how to get there and be in it for the long haul, and how to trust that maybe we're not the ones that are going to see the eventual 5 to 10 year outcomes, but we are committed to building the infrastructure and the system to make sure it happens. I don't know if that made sense. Okay. So we're going to come back to this stair-step thing that's on your page, but really, in that spirit, I think, there's this ecosystem of all of the diversity of people that are in this room and in other rooms, right? Because it's probably not just you. But you're probably a big chunk of the people that could play a deep leadership role in making this picture happen, and thinking about sort of where your organization falls on this continuum. And we're going to have some discussion about this in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about child and youth outcomes. I did a little bit of looking at Ohio Kids Count data just to have a sense of where some of the key indicators that would tell us what the outcomes look like for children and youth in the state. And there's, as in many states, some bleak data points that everyone, I'm sure, is well aware of here. And I heard Tracy mentioned even just the incarcerated piece. So 10% of children have a parent who's ever been incarcerated in this state. And this is 2014 data, because kids count can be a little bit lagging in terms of the time frame. But, there's 24% of children in households that were food insecure at some point in that year. 56% of Black children ages 0 to 5 live in poverty. 20% of children have at least one emotional, behavioral, or developmental condition that they're facing. So, there are a lot of outcomes that need improving and a lot to keep your eye on. This is just a sampling of, the outcomes that we could be tracking and looking at for young people. So it becomes challenging, right, at a state level, at a big picture level, to keep your arms around all of these outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I joke that, it's not funny, but I joke that it's sort of like that game Whack-A-Mole. You remember Whack-A-Mole from the Chuck E. Cheese, where, a negative trend starts to pop up in one indicator. Teen pregnancy is starting to go up, so we whack that mole and we, focus on trying to turn the curve on the teen pregnancy indicator, and we can run around like crazy people trying to do that indicator by indicator by indicator, or in our separate silos trying to sort of tackle one indicator at a time. I put this example up because the state of Maryland has, I think, done a very good job over the course of the past 20 years of setting some really broad, big population level outcomes that they want to see and tracking those consistently over time, and showing how they can move the needle on some of these big pieces by staying focused on a set of high level results. So I encourage places to really think about doing that. So one of the things that we do is help people to sort of put things into a manageable frame. And so we use a lot of dashboards. So this dashboard shows sort of by ages and by outcomes, what are the things that we want to see in each of those areas developmentally, and what would the outcome that would make us happy be. And so helping people to do that, and then to think about, okay, so how are we doing? This is an example from some work I did in King County, where they wanted to understand across this dashboard, the red means they're not doing so well. Green means obviously it's improving or doing better, and yellow, of course, is sort of somewhere in the middle. But helping them to understand, okay, here's our big picture of outcomes. How are we doing, and what sort of targets do we want to set, and how are we going to get there? So finding some creative ways to sort of organize your thinking around outcomes is always advisable. This is just one more example. You probably can't see it from where you are, but from Alexandria, as they developed a child and youth master plan for their city and wanted to track data over time. And one of the challenges with outcomes is that we track a lot. You saw that list of Ohio outcomes. We track a lot of negative indicators. We rarely have sort of positive indicators that we're trying to measure what it is we want for young people, right? Not only what it is we don't want for young people. So in Alexandria, they came up with a few. There was one around cultural competence. They wanted to be able to measure that over time. Caring adults, planning and decision making. They started to define some new indicators that they could use to say, we think we are getting young people where they need to be. So just in summary on the outcomes piece, we encourage people to sort of think of this as a target. And oftentimes with a target, you're trying to hit the bullseye, and we know that people are often hyper-focused on academic and vocational productivity for young people, right? But what we try to stress is that if you want to get to that center of the target, you absolutely have to pay very close attention to these two outer rings of the target, because as you all know, as practitioners in this space, if young people are not physically healthy and safe, if they're not socially and emotionally and civically connected, they are less likely and probably not able to be academically and vocationally productive. So, helping people to sort of wrap their arms around the big outcomes and think about how to get there. So how to get there is really, well, we'll do one more poll question and then we'll talk about how to get there. So this one, I want you to, before you answer, pause for a second and think about, in these areas, academic, career, social, emotional, physical health, safety, civic, what is the area you track the most data in your work? So most of you are going to use some kind of measure to say, we're getting to where we need to be for young people. In what area do you track the most data? I think we could have all probably assumed social emotional would be high for this group, right? You're the social emotional people. But interesting that there's some that are tracking some civic outcomes, and some of you tracking academic. Not much on the career front or vocational. So it's just important, and then we could of course have asked what's the second most thing that you're tracking. So I'm sure that many of you are tracking additional things, but it's just interesting to think about: are we tracking the right set of outcomes to ensure young people's success, or who do we need to start to partner with to ensure that success? Okay, we're moving on from that. So to talk about what is that right set of family, school, and community supports, oftentimes, and you know, we talk to a lot of educator groups, right? So they'll say, okay, we're really focused in on what's happening in the school. But developmentally, if we think about the school as one of those supports and opportunities, it really only covers a small portion of childhood and youth, right? And then if you think about the times of day and where young people are actually spending their waking hours, it only covers another portion of that. And then you think about all of those outcomes that we were talking about, and how much the school building is a place where they're getting an opportunity to do that, to learn those skills and get those experiences. School's really only filling a small portion of this sort of developmental white space, if you will. And as you all know, young people will fill their developmental white space one way or another, and it would be nice if we could help them fill it in a positive way with opportunities to gain all of those important skills. So, we think it's really important to, if your community is trying to achieve collective impact, to really think about who are all of those stakeholders that are responsible for filling that developmental white space. And so this is just sort of a sampling, and I'm sure how many of you feel like you partner with the majority of the folks that are on this list, or at least say half of the folks on this list? Okay. So, encouraging people to think about how you reach out to some of these folks and start to partner with them to fill that developmental white space. So one thing I like to ask is, say this young man, happens to be my son, but say it's just any young man, walks in and he is looking for a job. You're an employer. And he says, well, I'm not a teen parent. I'm not in a gang. I am not a high school dropout. Can I have a job? Would, Valerie, I'll pick on you. Would you hire him? Minus the fact that he's my son, and of course you would. You don't know? Why don't you know? You would hire him. Okay, anybody else that wouldn't hire him? Yes? Yes.
What's the school attendance like? Is he still enrolled or did he drop out?
Right. So the notion that he hasn't told you what he can do, we've only sort of said what he hasn't done that's negative, right? And unfortunately, we tend to organize ourselves in this child and youth field in some what I think are potentially counterproductive ways. So this donut in the middle tends to be how policies are developed. It tends to be how we interact or intervene with young people, and we sort of lose sight of those things around the outside, right? That really, we're really trying to get them to these things in the outer ring, but we end up focusing on the things in the inner ring. And essentially, the science has shown, and there's a great resource from some years ago now, Community Programs to Promote Youth Development, that outlined a set of core supports and opportunities that young people need to get to improved outcomes. And so we know that these pieces, these components, if present in any program where young people spend their time, are likely to get them to improved outcomes. And so really, if we wanted to organize ourselves in incredibly effective ways, we would make any program that we put together have opportunities for young people to do these things. And we wouldn't worry so much about, I'm from Missouri, and for a while we had a meth problem. And so, the response to this meth problem was the legislature looked at the data and said, okay, well, let's create a meth prevention task force, and let's, have that task force come up with some recommendations. And then that task force, of course, says, well, we need a meth prevention program. And so then a meth prevention program gets created. And so it starts to proliferate in that way, when really all we need to do is make sure that young people are getting opportunities to do this. So it's hard to get out from under that, right? It's really challenging, I think, to move away from that. So one other thing that I wanted to make sure to touch on, and this is old data now that we did probably, I would say 2007 or something like that, where we surveyed youth workers from around the country in a number of different parts of the country. And we found that, these youth workers, I call them, there's not really a field per se, but when they answered these questions, the things that they needed to become more of a field and to really feel like there was a network of people that supported them and were encouraging their development as a field, links between training and reward were weak at best. There weren't clear promotion opportunities. I know that from my own experience as a youth worker that, I eventually had to leave. I had a child and I wanted to, do something that would support my family, and I had to move on from my youth worker job. And so really finding those opportunities to be supportive of the field so that quality piece that is so critical to that middle gear is possible. And so I want to ask you all a question in just a minute about that. But back on that meth thing, I would just say, this is a real picture from LA County, and this is from some years ago now too, but every single place I go and put this picture up, people say that absolutely resonates with our experience here, even in the smallest communities. So the notion that there's all these different systems that are put in place to support children and youth, and education and child and family services, mental health and probation, et cetera. And there's all these programs supported in those systems. But if you took a real family and you showed how those programs could connect to support that family, this is the picture that you get. And they took the forms in that a family would have to complete in order to access some of these programs and services. And it was a stack this big, and the LA County Commission was like, I don't think we could complete those forms. So along this whole picture, there are a lot of opportunities for improvement, both up at that, leaders of those different agencies within those programs, so that people aren't working at cross purposes sometimes, and they're not, unsure who's on first and who's tackling which aspects of a young person or a family's experience. And then, of course, the family experience. I think of like when you walk into the Apple store or something and somebody just immediately asks you what your needs are, and they point you exactly in the right direction of who can support you at that Genius Bar. We should have something that's more like that to support children and their families in accessing these services. So the alternative sort of picture to that we like to talk about is thinking about really, yes, the education pipeline at the center, and paying attention to those points in the pipeline where young people can kind of start to fall out. But to keep them from falling out, it's really important to have this insulation around the pipeline. And so how do you develop a seamless set of supports in your community that prevents young people from not making it out the other end, and age-appropriate supports? Those basic services are critical, but also those social emotional supports in that middle space. And so encouraging communities to think up how they can put those services in place and organize themselves in a way that feels more like a clean trade-off, like a handoff, I should say, from one service to the next, and so that young people have a more smooth experience. So going back to that question about youth workers, I wanted to pose a question to you all before we leave this topic of the family, school, and community support. So what are the most important first steps to strengthen the field of youth work, I'm just going to call it that, in your mind? Is it training and professional development? Is it promotion opportunities? Is it compensation? Of course, always, right? Compensation. But think hard about the first step. Is the first step better defining the field? Is there some other important first step? I'd be curious if anybody wants to yell out if you have another thing that you think would help strengthen this field from where you sit. Many of you said you were practitioners, so you're in it. What is the thing that would help you the most? Respect. Yes, sister. Anything else? Great. So training and professional development. So maybe this conference is one nice opportunity for, maybe that's why there's so many people here, right? You all want to feel like you're a part of a collective group. It's your peers. These are your people. Great. So then moving into this notion of leader accountability, and by the way, I should say when we talk about leaders, we're talking about leaders of all stripes, grassroots, grass tops, young people, families, policymakers, city, county, state, federal, the whole gamut of leaders. But because you're here as part of a state agency's work, and I come from the policy background, I thought I'd share, when you think about a typical state org chart, when you start trying to think about how you would make better sense of the connections across departments and agencies, I can't even see that. I think it's the Department of Community-Based Services over here. And what if they wanted to work with the Department of Juvenile Justice to collaborate on something for youth? How would they even find each other? How would they manage to, get over there? So there's a lot, I think, of opportunity to break down some of these silos and bust some of them open. And I'll mention a little bit later the Ohio Family and Children First Council, and Tracy and Chad are here from that group here in Ohio. But it's really important to have some infrastructure that allows that kind of communication, continuous communication that's so important to collective impact, in place in your state, in your county, in your city, to help those communications to happen. And if that wasn't convincing enough, this is a real picture from Rochester, New York, where they mapped the task forces, collaborations, committees, coalitions that support children and youth in their community. And this is what they found. So I'm curious, how many of you go to some of these kinds of meetings here in your state, in your community? Do you go to, do you sit on any collaborative bodies or coalitions or anything like that? Yeah. How many, keep your hands up high, how many of you go to more than 3 of those? How many of you go to more than 5 of those? Anybody go to upwards of like 8 of those things? So there are people that are spending a large chunk of their day going to coalition meetings, and so we've also got to get better at how we organize our work and how we think about being in partnership with others. And so, and I sometimes blame the feds in some ways because, you write a federal grant and they say, oh, well, you need to demonstrate that you have a collaborative group. And so people go off and create a new collaborative group to meet the needs of a federal grant. Well, push back on the feds on that. We're making good progress with them around, if a community or a state already has collaboration that kind of fits that, they can use it. And so we're trying to get that written into, federal statute, into state statute, so that people don't feel like they have to go off and create a new thing. But, finding ways to connect some of these dots. We do something that we call mapping your moving trains. And we help communities think about, this is the actual sort of partnerships and collaboratives in, I think this is Louisville, but trying to get a handle on, okay, across this education pipeline, right, across those ages and across all of those developmental domains and the insulation that we want to provide, what are we focusing on as a group of coalitions, and how could we work better together? How could we knit these things together in a more effective way? Another thing that I've spent a lot of time over the past decade doing with places is helping them to do children's budget analysis. So fiscal mapping is what we tend to call it. And the notion that in that crazy spaghetti slide that I put up, there's funding streams attached to each of those programs, right? And they're all coming from different levels of government and so many different things moving, right? And so how, by the time it lands in a community, are you to make sense of the dollars that are available to support this picture? And so when I did a early fiscal map in my home state in Missouri years ago and looked at all of the different state agencies and the funding that was there to support youth. And for instance, I found 8 different state agencies that had a funding line item to support mentoring. Well, that's great. It's really good, but are those mentoring line items connecting across these agencies in any way? Is there any sort of common training and professional development to make that more effective? And so I really encourage places to think about doing some sort of a fiscal map to understand, because by the way, I would go to the Missouri legislature and say, oh, we absolutely need more money for youth development. And until I had that map, they would say, well, how much money do you currently have for youth development? I have no idea, I don't know, because it's spread into the ether all, across these different departments. So having a good handle on where the resources are, what they flow to, what outcomes they flow to, what ages they flow to. Are they focused on positive development? Are they focused on just treatment and intervention? What's the funding picture look like? So in terms of thinking then about that leader gear and how do you get started and how do you get organized, we've got some tools to help people think about, okay, how do we build the broad partnership that we need in our community? How do we then ensure that we're setting the goals big enough that we're going to get young people to where we want them to be? How do we then use better data and information to inform our work and inform our decision making as a partnership? And how do we implement bolder strategies than a meth prevention program, right? How do we start to think about policy and resource alignment, wide-scale system improvement, engaging young people and their families in decision-making, these kinds of things. And the bold strategies really, involve all of those things and also involve increasing the public and the private sector demand for more and better services. So, I think there's some things that we can do to think outside the box and to work differently together to get young people ready. So now I want to take a few minutes and have you at your table really pull this handout out. I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and take some time to review what's on there and to think about this ecosystem and discuss where you think your organization is doing most of its work currently, and then maybe where would you like it to be, say, in a year or two from now, because if we know that leaders can change what they're doing in it, year to 2 years, I'd love to have you think about that. What's your sort of stretch goal? We're gonna get some mics going around in a second because I want to hear what some of the conversation was. But before we do that, let's get the pulse of the room here. Where on the collective impact spectrum, I'm calling it, would you plot your organization's current work? So if you look on the page, the colors associate with sort of those two columns. So green is improved program performance, red is increased program reach, blue is integrated program strategies, and yellow is cross-sector leadership. So this notion that, it really takes all of these things going. Maybe the very first green is not the most ideal place to be, but everywhere else is an important place on this continuum. And you might have noticed I don't use the words collective impact a whole lot because I fear that in some ways we are bankrupting the term, as we do in this country with many different terms, right? And so really reserving that term collective impact for those population level change, big picture, outcome change groups in a community that are providing sort of that infrastructure and leadership so that the rest of this picture can happen and be well organized. So I kind of try to, and we could have some discussion about that, but I kind of try to reserve that term for that and then help people really think about where they are playing their most important role, everyone playing their right role in making this happen. So it looks like green, there's a number of you that are doing that kind of coordination with other complementary kinds of services. Red, you've got the most of, and that's that idea that, we're actually going to do some combined service work, potentially even blend what we're doing together, have maybe some MOUs together. The blue, less so, and yellow, even less so. And I think that's probably a great representation of what it should and could look like, right? You don't want everybody working in the same space. You want to have some of these different things going. You want to have those integrated networks of systems that can go deep and really make sure that they're providing access to all kinds of things, but you want to have fewer governance bodies. This is a problem we have around the country. In some communities and states, there are multiple coordinating bodies, and you wonder who's on first, right? Who's moving this dial? So that's really interesting. As the policy person at the forum, I have to leave you with a few policy ideas. One, and I've mentioned this already, is please, well, raise your hand first of all if you connect with your local Ohio Family and Children First Council. Oh, Chad, doesn't that warm your heart? So I think you've got a really excellent infrastructure already in place here in Ohio that you could build from in this work. And it's much like the state of Maryland. There's really only a couple states in the country that have this kind of infrastructure to support children and youth and to bring those state stakeholders together, and then in each county to bring those county stakeholders together. So I really, encourage people to, if you're not yet, connect with those local councils and see how you can build on that work together. We recently, with FSG, the folks that brought you the term collective impact, wrote a policy paper that really tried to articulate largely for state and local policymakers, what are some of the things that public policy can do to be more supportive of collective impact on the ground. And we came up with a whole host of things and examples from places, and these are just some of them. So if you're a policy nerd like me and you're interested, you can check this paper out on our website, and I'll give you some links in a second. So I mentioned at the very beginning, I am very passionate, dogged even, in this next decade of my career in helping communities, largely cities and counties, secure, dedicated local public funding streams that they can use to support children and youth. And I've been starting to track the places that have done this, and it's a surprising sort of motley crew of communities that have been able to literally go to their voters and say, should we tax ourselves? I said the word. Should we tax ourselves to pay for children's services? And voters have been fairly overwhelmingly supporting this notion. And so the map looks quite funny on this screen, but there's about 8 counties in Florida that have done it. In my home state in Missouri, 8 counties have done this. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Missouri politics, but that voters would vote to tax themselves to pay for children's services in that state is a pretty remarkable thing. Many cities along the West Coast, the one I'm really excited about just last week is Philadelphia passing a soda tax that's going to cover pre-K, it's going to cover communities and schools, parks and rec, all of these things that we struggle to find a way to pay for, and they have just done it. It's going to generate $91 million a year in Philly to support those things. So I say that, and people can challenge me, but I think that we have sort of a perfect storm brewing right now that would allow this to happen in a lot of places. So well-documented opportunity divide. We know that the difference in enrichment experiences and opportunities from wealthy to poor is just not okay. There's no new federal or state resources coming anytime soon. I'm just here to tell you, in case you haven't gotten that memo, there are no new funding streams that are being generated at that level. We know that early intervention and prevention works, and so we just can't seem to find a way to pay for it and get out from under the deep end stuff, right? The use of evidence, everybody's talking about, using evidence these days, but how are you going to pay for these, gold standard evidence-based programs if you don't have an infusion of some new resources? And then that collective impact partnerships, I think, are really getting ready for this. Many of these partnerships around the country are going to have developed these beautiful plans for what should happen for children and youth, and then look around the table and go, how are we going to pay for it? So I think that there's a real window of opportunity, and if anybody in any of the communities here in Ohio is interested in learning more about some of the tools and resources I'm pulling together on this particular piece, please email me. I assume my email will be in something, yeah? But I'd love to talk to you about how we're sort of helping communities lay the groundwork for this kind of a thing, and not to be scared of it, because it can feel like a scary thing. So a few resources that'll be in your, I think, thumb drive, but things that I've sort of touched on that might be useful to you. And then just a reminder, and I'm actually going to hop to this next slide, just a reminder that if we can start to really turn that leader gear, we're going to turn it, and work better together, do business differently together, we can probably see in a couple of years, we can start to move in the direction of a more coordinated picture in that middle piece, right? And then we're ultimately going to be able to track and get to improved youth outcomes. So I encourage you all to keep doing what you're doing, and to work together always better, and get to these outcomes for young people. And I want to just thank you all for listening to my saga of what I've learned over the past couple decades, and wish you a really great rest of your conference.